to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and we are returning to a topic that is, I would say, a perennial one in Vermont, but definitely a perennial one on this show, and that is how Vermont funds education. And our lovely co-host and representative, Emilie Kornheiser, is a member of a task force whose name always escapes me, but it's to implement, you're tasked with implementing the Colby report, basically the recommendations in the Colby report, which was a UVM report that came out, was it in 2019 at this point, Emilie? It feels forever ago.
So it is. I'm co-chair of the task force on the implementation of the pupil weighting factors report. And the report came out on December 24th, 2019, and then was updated on January 18th, 2020. Okay. And if I've learned anything from this process, I've learned that when one creates a task force in statute, one should be mindful of how many times they'll have to say the name of that task force aloud.
Yeah, there's no, like last week we talked to Charlie Kimball about the Rural Economic Development Caucus, and they have a great name, Red Wing. So where's your great name, honey?
It cannot even be abbreviated. It is just.
Which I guess is kind of an overview to how complicated funding education is in Vermont. Yes, a report from the before times. So just to bring folks up to date, the task force is looking through the report Emilie just mentioned, and in December we'll be delivering your findings and what I think is exciting, an action plan about how you're going to implement these recommendations, if you're going to tweak them at all. And you've been meeting pretty like once a month.
More often than that. I think we had 10 meetings in statute. And so it's been somewhere between, sometimes it's once a month, sometimes it's twice a month, sometimes it's a couple weeks in a row.
Well, the next one coming up is November 10th, I believe.
Whatever next Wednesday is, yeah.
Okay, yes, November 10th. We both have deadlines that day. And I was reading through, the task force recently sent, it's an 8-member task force, 4 Senate, 4 reps. And you recently asked some questions of Tammy Colby and the research team. And I was just reading through that memo this morning, their responses. And I think for me, it just brought home how, Tammy put forward, and the research team, I should give them all credit, put forward a number of recommendations about how we could better fund education, particularly for students who are either of low income in geographically rural areas, students whose first language is not English. And they seem very simple on the surface. And yet what the impression I was getting from this memo was each time you kind of pull a thread and say, well, exactly how would this work in the real world? It's just like a ball of yarn that has just really gotten tangled, and every time you pull one piece, another piece kind of knots up. Is that your experience, Emilie, or is that just for me on the surface what it looks like?
That is very much my experience. It's actually part of why I wanted to be on this task force, because I think one of my core goals as a legislator is to stay curious about the work I'm doing. And because of this constant pulling of threads, because of the mix of some really deep academic research and some very practical policy concerns, there needs to be a really constant process of discovery and reevaluating and shifting in order to just get this work done. And so, yes, that's very much my experience so far. And I appreciate that you noticed that in just reading this few-page memo. I would love to just back up a little bit just to lay the groundwork for folks. So when this report first came out on December 24th, 2019, which is Christmas Eve.
Before times.
It's both the before times, pre-pandemic. It is also Christmas Eve. The legislature has this very difficult pattern that I keep on trying to push against as like a baby project of having all of our reports due to us on somewhere between December 15th and January 15th, which means that no one really has the bandwidth to read them or act on them before the legislature starts.
I completely agree with you. I have issues with that too.
Yeah, it's very challenging. So anyway, it's sort of like how if anyone watches any presidential dramas, I will admit I'm a little bit of a sucker for the presidential dramas, West Wing, Madam President, whatever. You always like bury the news on a Friday night, the big news.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes the reports being buried on Christmas Eve is part of that. But back to the topic at hand. Olga and I interviewed Professor Colby very soon after the report came out. So if people want to go into the Wayback Archives, this is before we were doing the joyful video calls. It was in the pre-pandemic times when we just had audio recordings. But they're still there in our archives on Captivate. And that was the first time that we talked to Professor Colby about this. And it was a great conversation, both in the weeds and sort of getting at the bigger picture. And for me, this is before I was on a committee that had any jurisdiction over this issue at all. This is when I was still on the Commerce Committee. And really curious.
Well, and I would say that her recommendations for many people were, yes, we knew this. And for others were really like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? Like, I think the reactions were pretty polarized as well.
Yeah. And so the question that the question that was asked of the researchers was essentially, if we maintain current law with the way education finance is structured, what would be a scientific way to apply weights to pupils for the purposes of calculating tax liability for communities? And when we say weights, I think it's even important to step back enough to say, when we say pupil weighting, we're talking about like pounds and ounces and percentages. We're not talking about time. So it's WEIGHT, not WAIT, pupil weighting.
Despite what some critics might say, yes.
Yes. And so it is, we are indeed spending a lot of time waiting on the task force for analysis to be done between our meetings, but the actual mathematical work we're doing is weighting, EIGHT, weighting. And so essentially almost every school system in the whole country has some system where students that we know cost more to educate, students living in poverty, English language learners, some states apply this to rural students, are counted in some way as more than one student. And because every state in the country has a slightly different way of funding education, those weights mean things in different states, and those weights are different in different states. But almost every state has some mechanism for saying these students cost more, and so these students count more. Most other states deliver some degree of dollars out of their state coffers to communities in a direct way. And so sometimes they are categorical grants that leave state coffers and go to communities based on the number of students in these categories. Sometimes it's that states deliver a lump sum to communities that is then increased by a certain percentage based on the number of students in these categories. That's called a weighted foundation formula. And then Vermont, once again, does something that's different than anywhere else.
We're special.
We are special. And this is actually a thing that's fairly special about us, like genuinely special. It has challenges in it, but it is, I think it is actually a place that some Vermont exceptionalism is warranted, in that the structure, the broader structure of our education funding system, not the particularities of the pupil weights, but the great big picture that we're spending not as much time talking about as we could during this task force, is really a profoundly progressive funding mechanism, small p progressive, meaning that more of the burden is carried by those who can most afford it. And we are spreading the cost across geographies. So most schools around the country we see huge disparities between schools in wealthy communities and schools in poor communities, because taxes are raised locally via property taxes to pay for schools.
Mm-hmm.
Is this an okay level of weeds, Olga?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I asked
no,
you,
I think this is,
I think this is good. When you want me to. Okay. When it's necessary. So please feel free to pull. And in Vermont, that was true. We had a foundation formula, like I said, a lot of other states do, that sent a lump sum from the state coffers that was had a percentage increase based on the population in the school, and state sent that out to every school every year. And then to make up the difference in how much they wanted to spend on their schools, schools would raise taxes locally, towns would raise taxes locally. 20-something years ago, all over the country, a bunch of very well-meaning families, parents, advocates started bringing lawsuits against schools and against states for these real huge discrepancies between different public schools in the same area. And the impact of those lawsuits were felt really differently in different states for different reasons. In Vermont, if anyone wants to remember back to the time in August when Olga and I read the Constitution aloud, or wants to go back and listen to those episodes, I find them very soothing. I think we did a very nice job. We learned a lot. What?
We learned a lot.
We did learn a lot. It was really, sometimes reading something aloud really like processes it so differently than reading it to yourself. Mm-hmm. So in Vermont, we actually have a provision in our state constitution around equal access to education for Vermont's children, which a lot of other states don't, because state constitutions were, drafted by humans negotiating with each other. Mm-hmm. Men, not even humans, white men. They were drafted by white men negotiating with each other many years ago. So we had this constitutional provision, which meant that when the lawsuit was brought in Vermont, that it was decided in favor of the folks bringing the lawsuit, mm-hmm. which is the plaintiffs. Just to use a
well done.
Thank you. So far from a law school education here. So what that meant is that then the legislature was tasked by Vermont Supreme Court to do something about this inequity. Mm-hmm. And that Supreme Court decision was called the Brigham decision. And it's actually remarkably short and readable if anyone wants to do that. It's only a couple pages long.
Maybe we should read that out loud sometime.
Maybe we should do like next summer when we're getting ready for a break, we could do like great court cases that shaped Vermont. Yeah, that sounds fun.
I think that's a ding right there.
Yeah, there's like that great Radio Lab series on the Supreme Court. I don't remember what it's called, but I had a really good time with that. I wish they were still doing that one. Anyway, so the Brigham decision said, basically, you need to fix this inequity. And Vermont legislature at the time passed something called Act 60, which I think most people have heard of.
And I think that's what most people refer to our education funding system as, it's Act 60 is kind of the shorthand.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in Act 60, we decided that the way we were going to fix the inequity is by focusing on access to funding for these communities. There were a lot of other paths we could have gone down. Mm-hmm. It could have been about stronger educational standards that schools were required to be held to. It could have been about how funds were sent to districts, like just actually increasing the foundation formula probably would have done it. Mm-hmm. But in fact, what we did was drastically remake our entire education funding system to create a much more equitable access to resources for each community. Mm-hmm. That's the choice that was made. That was in compliance with Brigham. But again, one of multiple choices that could have been made at that point. And then here we are. And there have been a number of other acts passed since then that tweaked it.
Yes.
So when that happened, we did many, many things with our education funding system, but the basics of what we did was decide that districts, schools, get to decide their own budget with their local voters, and any budget that they vote on and pass, the state will raise the funds necessary to send them back that budget.
Mm-hmm.
And each community is responsible for a share of those taxes.
Mm-hmm.
But because of a lot of mechanisms that are built in, this is sort of the threads and the weeds that Olga alluded to at the beginning, the burden is carried across the state in a variety of ways. And one of the ways that happens is something called the equalized pupil.
Mm-hmm.
One of the ways that's done. There's also the common level of appraisal, which we have barely talked about on the Pupil Weighting Task Force, and we're not going to talk about today, but is very interesting and could use some time.
It is fascinating.
A number of interesting episodes in between.
Yeah, we would have to bring an expert on, because it's like education funding. On one hand, it's very simple on the surface, but then once you get into the mechanics and how it actually, what it ripple effects, it can be a little bit of a brain twister.
Yeah, so maybe we can do that in a couple months, because I think if we did those 2 episodes in a row, we would lose some listeners. So
you might lose us.
So the way the equalized pupil count is determined, and I'm not going to give all the details on this either, but part of it is that when we're counting pupils in each school, students who are English language learners or living in poverty are counted more than students who are not. They count as more than one student.
And sometimes that's a percentage, and it can look odd on paper, but that's the concept behind it.
Yes, exactly. And so the way that we determined in Act 60 how much more a student was counted for the purpose of counting the students to then figure out the tax liability, we brought over the exact same weights as we had used in the foundation formula when it was actually just about sending money to districts.
Okay, that I didn't realize. I was wondered where those weights came from.
No one knows where the foundation formula weights came from, though.
Yeah, I think that was one of the criticisms in the Colby report, actually, is like, what is this math based on?
Yeah. And so one of the things that's, I think, interesting about this is, best intentions, bringing over a weight from one system to another, did not say we're using these weights very, very differently in these 2 systems. One is actually about delivering dollars and one's about delivering tax liability. Maybe we should use new numbers. And the other piece that I think is really, really important and interesting and makes me remember that time does in fact move forward is that we in fact did not have the statistical computing capacity at that time to easily actually figure out what an accurate weight would be.
Huh. Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And so, yeah.
Let that sit in for a minute.
I mean, we might have been able to come up with something slightly better than we did, but we really didn't have the level of statistical computing capacity available to the average researcher to do the kind of really huge data set analysis that Professor Colby and her team did on this. So that's a lot of the background.
Well, I appreciate that, Emily. And I want to step in quickly and just say, because some folks in Vermont are really, really entrenched in education funding and revising education funding. And so for them, they're probably sitting there going, oh my God, I know this. Why are you going over this again? And I just want to point out that one thing I feel very, very passionate about is that you can never control when someone enters the conversation. And so you never know what background information they have. And I think given how intense and layered and multifaceted and emotional our education conversation can be, I feel it's really important to go back over that territory so that if there's anyone new to this, they have a good foundation to understand things. So thank you for that, Emily.
The other thing that I think is really important about that, and absolutely everyone always enters these conversations at all different points and from all different perspectives, is that we're very quickly going to start talking about things like marginal effects and equalization and the difference between multiplicative and additive. And it's the only way to have this conversation. And the vast majority of people I know have really significant math trauma from school. And this study does not address math trauma. But what I've realized is, so I grew up in a place where we were doing algebra at the dinner table in elementary school. Like, my dad is super geeky, super into numbers. I just grew up living and breathing math and never had, there's all of these really incredible education studies about what happens to girls in middle school and their comfort and aptitude for math, and how there's a huge drop off. And so it took me actually a long time to find my way back to enjoying math after that happened. And it was fun in college in a psychology class, which is, women's work, to learn. That was sarcastic. Anyone who did not catch that, to learn that this thing that happened to me was part of a pattern that happens to lots and lots of women and girls in America. But I've been super grappling with how to explain these complicated concepts in a way that people's brains don't shut down. And so that's a fun part of this conversation too.
That's really interesting. Well, we have about 5 minutes before we have to hear from some underwriters. And that is one question I wanted to ask you, Emilie. As you've been serving on this task force, 20 years or so is a long time for a system to be in place. And it's basically a generation in many respects, as far as elementary to high school goes. And for many communities, Act 60 is a very fraught topic. Sometimes just emotional, but often they have very good reasons behind those responses, positive or negative. And so I'm wondering, for you, as the task force is diving into this issue, how much is that playing a role? Do you feel you have been able to sweep the stage clear of emotions, or are you still wading through those? And how is that either helping or hindering the process?
Oh, yeah, great question. I was ready to talk about what the study did, but this is a very interesting question, Olga.
Good.
So in our enabling legislation, it specifically asks us to be sort of considerate of the intention of Act 60, 66, 46, and 173. And a lot of the folks who helped craft Act 60 are still fairly active in Montpelier. And so it's a whole generation, but they're still at the table. And that has been really, really helpful to actually get some context about Act 60. And so one of our analysts from JFO, who sort of retired and has come back as a consultant to train new staff at JFO.
That's the Joint Fiscal Office, for anyone who doesn't know.
Her name's Deb Brighton, and she was also sort of independently chair of the Tax Structure Commission and came on the show also at some point in the last year. She, as part of our conversations, has occasionally gone into her barn and found a graph, like a mimeographed graph.
Oh my gosh.
From some magical thing that happens in her barn that I desperately want to see, because I can't imagine my barn being organized enough to I don't actually have a barn, but whatever. My basement is not organized enough to find old files like that. But, and she's pulling out these mimeographed graphs that were part of the Act 60 conversation for us to have context. But that's fairly unusual that someone has that level of archival capacity.
Organization.
Or organization, yeah. So that's part of it, that we have people who are part of that conversation and can bring that conversation forward, which is rare in legislative work. Often we're saying what was the intention here? And we don't know, so we're just going to reinvent it. It's part of the 2-year legislative cycle too. And then we have communities who are still deeply engaged and feel deeply hurt by Act 60, who are showing up at this table as their opportunity to sort of fix things that they felt never got fixed, or to Yeah, that's how I'll end that sentence. And then there's also a lot of folks around the state who were really energized or activated around Act 46, which on some level was about school funding.
Yeah.
And again, was not in the legislature during Act 46 either. But again, an issue that really divided communities, a lot of conversations around why should my wealthy town be responsible for this poor town? Why should a lot of poor towns saying, why should this wealthy town have governance over me and my kids? A lot of talk around like, whose kids are my kids? And that happened in Act 46 and that happened in Act 60. And yes, there are still really heightened emotions from that. And people with very different memories of sort of what has happened since then. Throwing into that mix is the fact, and I was talking to a friend about this morning, and actually to some folks in my work life about this yesterday. Everyone is really heightened right now. Everyone is drowning a little bit and failing a little bit in their work life. Everyone I know. And my paid work is actually to talk to nonprofits all over the country. And so like, I can tell you that like folks in Wyoming are drowning and folks in Oakland, California are drowning and folks in the Twin Cities are, Minneapolis, St. Paul, they're also drowning. Everyone's drowning. And folks in Vermont are drowning. And that's true in our schools, for our school administrations, like everyone is struggling right now. And we all have like super limited bandwidth and we're all sort of like quick to be angry all the time, myself included. And so that's like a really rich emotional environment to be doing tax law.
Well, which taxes in of themselves often tend to be a pressure point for a lot of people. Yeah.
And then the last part that I think is really important to name is that since Act 60, the demographics of our communities have changed significantly. The impacts of poverty are felt differently in our communities. The face of poverty is different in our communities. And our human services agencies are more stripped than they were 20 years ago and have less capacity to show up in communities than they did. And so what I've seen so far is a lot of folks really desperate and painful to be heard about the struggles that their schools are experiencing because of poverty and because of racism. And that is something that I feel so deeply from living here in Brattleboro and knowing and loving my community and the work that I did at Youth Services and with DCF. And that struggle and like what it means in tax policy is something that I'm sitting with all the time. But when I'm talking about adding and multiplying, I think it's really hard to communicate that level of emotion. And so that also is some of the disconnect I think that we're experiencing.
Thank you, Emilie. I thank you for wrapping your arms around that for us, because I really, I feel, for better or for worse, the ongoing legacy of Act 60 on the ground level, there have been positive and negatives, and we can probably talk about those all day. But I don't think we should ever forget how emotional Act 60 is, but also just education is, because for a lot of people, it's their children, their grandchildren, their nieces, their nephews, their cousins who are being impacted by this. And I just don't think we can lose sight of that. We're going to hear from some underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, and we will be back in a moment. Thanks. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on Brattleboro Community Television and a number of PEG stations around Vermont, and even a couple in Massachusetts, of all things, and at our Captivate webpage and wherever you find podcasts. Hey, Emilie, what do we need to remind folks of?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests separately, and not the radio station, nor the multinational conglomerate that is hosting live streaming right now, nor anywhere else that it might be broadcast. It's just the opinion of the host and the guests. Thank you.
Thank you. Those of you who are just joining us today, Emilie and I are talking about education funding, as you have heard us talk about before. But Emilie is the co-chair of a task force that is aimed at implementing different recommendations from the pupil weighting study that was released in 2019. And they have a report that's due to the legislature in early to mid-December. Yay. And I will be linking in the show notes. So you can find those either where you find your podcasts or on our Captivate page, to where you can go to find videos of the meetings they've been having, different paperwork and reports that are part of the process at the Joint Fiscal Office's website. Whew. Emilie.
Yeah.
What are some of the things you're actually working on in the task force? Do you have any preliminary recommendations you can share?
Yeah. So first, I want to sort of explain what the report did just a little bit.
Okay.
So is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And again, if people are just joining us, we're talking about pupil weighting in terms of WEIGHT, not pupil weighting WAIT.
Are people actually saying that to you? Is that some of the
yeah, just like occasionally when I'm just sort of talking about casually, people are like, people waiting what? What are they waiting for? It's just like when someone's like, why are you going to Montpelier? It's not like someone who's actually following the work of the task force.
I couldn't tell if you were getting snarky comments or genuine curious comments.
It's just like when I talk about it in passing, people are like, what are they waiting? You know, it's just.
Gotcha.
When you look at it, I think most people have seen it on paper who I'm talking to about it. And so then you don't even realize that it's the same thing, but in passing, sometimes people get curious about it. Because, there is actually a task force that's charged with medical wait times, and that's WAIT, right? So both can happen in the politics. Okay.
Fair enough.
So the study. And Olga, I think we should do a show about social media and politics in Vermont, because my feelings about the Facebook are, they're big right now. And I think they're big for a lot of people right now. And
my paying job, we were talking about this yesterday, and we think we're actually going to leave Facebook.
Yeah. So I don't think I can. And so I would love to just talk about that for a while on the show. I think that's a really interesting thing.
Sure,
okay.
Sure.
So the Pupil Weighting Factors Report was commissioned by the legislature. The contract was held between the Agency of Education and a team of researchers. Professor Colby at the University of Vermont, Bruce Baker at Rutgers University, and then two researchers, Drew Atkinson and Jesse Levin, who are both at the American Institutes for Research, which is a think tanky thing. So again, the contract was held by the Agency of Education, not by the legislature. Sometimes the legislature holds consulting contracts.
Yeah, good point.
And what they were tasked to do is to say, if the weights were going to be recalibrated according to the existing law, so all the other math that's in existing law stays the same, what would accurate weights be? And what they did in order to figure that out is they put all of these different things around school spending, the amount of money schools were spending, the amount of money that districts were spending, the amount of money that states were spending. They put them all into a great big statistical machine. I really hope Professor Colby doesn't hear me describing it this way because it's ridiculous. They put them into a great big statistical machine.
But it gives images, which are important.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. Great big statistical machine, along with information about students and students' reading scores and math scores as a way of sort of measuring achievement and student demographics. So, the poverty level in the schools, the number of English language learners in the schools, all those things, and said, how much more needs to be spent on a student who is living in poverty in order for their test scores to be the same as a student who's not living in poverty. Okay. And so that sort of much bigger question around why do students who are living in poverty tend to have much lower test scores than students who aren't, that is not part of the study, that why, or what's the best intervention in order to have students living in poverty get to the same test score as students who are not living in poverty. That's also not part of the study. All that the study, go ahead.
No, sorry, finish that thought and then
All that the study was tasked with was, given the exact math and current law, what are the accurate weights to bring students spending for students who are not living in, who are living in poverty to the same test score as students who are not living in poverty. And I've spent spent a few years of my career focused very much on what are the actual interventions we need to do in communities in order to bring students' test scores who are living in poverty up to the same level in poverty. That's part of what I did when I worked at DCF under a specific grant. But here we're just talking about what are the dollar differences between these two things.
Well, and I just wanted to say, I think sometimes that's what can lead folks to feeling a little frustrated or even confused around education funding in Vermont, is because we're kind of, I think so often when we think of education, we're thinking of classes, we're thinking of interventions, we're thinking of those kind of social collateral type things, for lack of a better term. And yet with Act 60 and what you're working on right now, Emilie, they're very nuts and bolts number mechanics. And so even folks who talk about Act 60, they say, there's equal access to opportunity, there's equal access to capital, money. Are they always the same thing? And I just want to point that out, because I think for some people, that's still an inner conflict for them about what are we talking about, which is more important to prioritize.
And it's sometimes explained the whole thing as like a three-legged dog, Vermont's educational funding formula. And I don't know if I've done that on this show yet.
I don't know either.
Seems like a memorable, ridiculous thing for me to say. But Vermont super prizes, for a lot of good reasons and a lot of challenging reasons, local control. And so all of those interventions are all decided at the local level. How the money is actually spent, all decided at the local level. What are we actually going to do about these differences in achievement? That's all decided at the local level. The only control we have at the state level is on this funding formula, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And so that's where we focus our energy. I think it also is worth saying, and I don't know if I've brought this into the conversation at all yet, any of the places I've had it. So a lot of folks know about the social indicators of health. And there's a bunch of really nice pie charts about how this fairly small percentage of your health outcomes or a community's health outcomes. And I think Ann Sosin talked about this when we were talking about COVID a few months, weeks in the more recent past.
In the COVID timeline.
Yeah. So the social indicators of health, there's a certain percentage that is of a community's health or an individual's health that's attributed or attributable to their actual health interventions, the things that doctors get involved in.
Right.
And then the vast majority of a individual or a community's health outcomes are decided outside of the medical realm. They're very much about socioeconomics, about housing, about community infrastructure, things like that. The social indicators of education are talked about less often, but the map is very, very similar in that it is a less than majority percentage that of a kid's educational outcomes that is attributable directly to education, to the interventions that happen in the school. So that's the context that we're doing this study in. And again, they did not get into that context. That was not their job at all to get into that context.
Right.
But what they were asked to do was, what is the marginal rate? What's the marginal effect difference when you spend more money on these kids who have more needs? And so that's what was delivered to us. What was also in the study is some commentary on pieces of current law that might not be the best choices. And so one of those pieces is how we measure poverty. So the study says educating students in poverty is more expensive. You should count students this much more if they're living in poverty for the purposes of calculating tax rates and equalized pupil counts because they cost more. But in order to count the number of students living in poverty, which we need to do in order to assign all of these percentages to them and weights to them, we need to actually figure out how to count them. And the way we count them in current law is very strange, and also I think came over from the foundation funding formula. And the way we count them is it's the number of families in the school system that are enrolled in food stamp benefits.
Oh, that's right.
Plus the number of English language learners. So any English language learner in a district is counted as living in poverty, regardless of their socioeconomic status, plus the number of state-placed students in a school. So that's like kids in foster care, for the most part. I'm doing some broad strokes here. So a few things about that measure. One, food stamps are a deep food stamp enrollment, not food stamp eligibility, is a deep, deep undercounting of poverty.
Yeah, it really
One,
is.
because a lot of people don't want to deal with food stamps because of shame. Paperwork. Two, a lot of people don't want to deal with food stamps because of paperwork. People tend to be more likely to enroll in food stamp programs if they live near a community, like a town hub. So if they live near a district office for the Agency of Human Services, they are more likely to enroll in food stamps because it is easier because they can get to the office. And it's actually just the eligibility for food stamps is a very, very low threshold of poverty. So there's that, just like drastic undercounting and regional disparities around food stamp enrollment. Why would all English language learners count as living in poverty? That's like both weird and racist and just weird.
Yeah, that's a definite bias right there.
So strange. And then state-placed students can be counted as living in poverty in other ways that it doesn't sort of make sense to count them automatically. But that one's the one that like sort of might make almost the most sense. But that's more counting trauma than poverty, actually. Because any state-placed student has experienced trauma in being removed from their family, regardless of why they were removed.
Yeah.
Lots of other studies about that we're definitely not going to talk about today. So we had a bunch of people in to talk to us about what's a good way to measure poverty. A lot of people would think the census is a good way to measure poverty, but it's not in Vermont because our census tracts are too small and aren't populated enough, and we have to suppress numbers for privacy, and our census data is terrible here. And I think we've talked about that on other episodes too. We're really building these conversations as the years go by, Olga. So can't use census data. Had the tax department in. The tax department has a deep, deep obligation to keep everything they do a secret. And there's good reason for that. So can't use tax data. What does that leave us with? So what that leaves us with is mostly free and reduced lunch data, which schools collect.
Okay.
And that is better than the super weird measure that we use now that is not used in any other context anywhere. Free and reduced lunch data is used for a lot more contexts. It's how federal funding is sent. A whole bunch of stuff comes from free and reduced lunch data. But there are problems with that too. And so one of the choices that we are making, we have not officially voted on, but is a preliminary decision and was recommended in the report, is moving to free and reduced lunch data, and then taking the next step of likely recommending the requiring a universal income form at schools rather than collecting free and reduced lunch data. So that would mean that all families needed to fill out this income declaration instead of just folks who want their kids to get free and reduced lunch. And that's something that's already used in Brattleboro schools. That's something that's already used in Burlington schools. It's something that's already used in the districts that have moved to a universal lunch program.
Okay.
But it's not used everywhere yet. And the form as we use it now is excessively complicated. And so we're working with some partners on how to simplify the form so that people actually fill it out accurately. But that will have lots of other really positive policy implications once we move to that form. But anyway, so we're moving to free and reduced lunch data as a placeholder because it's much better than what we were doing. And
interesting.
Everyone agrees on that. That's one preliminary decision.
Okay.
Another preliminary decision is that there's this thing in the formula on how we figure out how the weights turn into the number of students that sometimes we multiply and sometimes we add. And no one knows why it was ever written that way.
Oh, no.
No one knows.
Okay.
And there was a while when we were still talking about this in committee before it came to the task force where I created all kinds of hypothetical scenarios for why that might make sense. But I don't need to get into those because like no one has any idea why that was a good idea in the first place. No one's come up like, we've asked Professor Colby, we've asked the Agency of Education, we've asked the folks who wrote Act 60. No one knows. So we're moving to an entirely additive system. And there's other reasons for that that might be interesting to get into, but I fear we are running out of time.
We are 10 minutes.
Great. So those two small decisions in the grand scheme of decisions, those two very common sense decisions, I guess is the best way to describe it, that have big ripple impacts, but are not particularly controversial. Both of them mean that the weights that were delivered to us in the report needed to be recalculated.
Yes.
That the weights that were delivered to us in the report are not appropriate for that new context that I just set by making changes that were recommended in the report and are a good idea. And so we then had to ask Professor Colby's team to recalculate the weights, and they very kindly did so. They are so far above and beyond their contract with us. Like, I can't believe that any of them would ever come and enter into a contract with us again. Like, it is just a wild journey that they have spent with us. And
yes. I will just quickly say, when I got to that part in the memo that you and I have referred to, where Professor Colby was like, as we know that you are under a time crunch here, so as a courtesy, we did all this math for you. I was just like, that is kindness. That's not just professional courtesy. That's true kindness, given everything that's on the task force plate right now. So yeah. I just want to make sure everyone knows that.
Yeah. And so, but what that means is that some of the spreadsheets that our JFO, so we have the weights, and then we have to say, what does it look like to put these weights to match up with every single school and district and their particular numbers and their particular situation. And so some of the schools are independent, like sometimes a school is a district, and sometimes 4 schools are part of a district, and sometimes 4 schools are part of 2 districts, and sometimes, we have a very complicated system of districts and unions and schools in Vermont. Before Act 46 we did, after Act 46 we did. It is a complicated situation. And so doing all of that, adding in the right data on SNAP or free and reduced lunch, what it looks like to pull the kids that are English language learners out of the poverty numbers, all of that all is something that our JFO staff had to build out with help from the Agency of Education, because most of the data sits at the Agency of Education, but the model's going to sit at part of the model is going to sit at Joint Fiscal Office. So them taking the weights and then saying, what does this actually mean for schools? That's what JFO is doing. And so once we got these recalculated weights, we then had to say, oh no, our almost ready spreadsheet is in fact not ready because we have to put the new weights into it. And so we've had 2 meetings that we've had to postpone because these are like massive, massive spreadsheets with like a million tabs where everything feeds each other. And if one district sends in the wrong data and says like that they're at 120% poverty, it doesn't just mess up that one district's row, it messes up because everything is equalized against each other, which I haven't talked about at all and is actually really important. It messes up it messes up the numbers for every other district. And so really excited about these new weights, really excited about Professor Colby's memo and the clarity it brings to the work we're doing. And it means that the numbers need to go back into the number machine, and we need to have this. So that's where we are. I think we're really close to being able to say like, okay, we have these weights and we made these preliminary decisions. What does this actually look like for schools and communities and tax rates? Because that's what everyone's waiting for, is to like scroll down the spreadsheet and say, what does this mean for me and my community?
Oh yeah. The first thing people will be doing is looking for their town name, and
yeah. And it's funny, I actually don't do that. I do that like fifth. I actually have these like target bellwether districts that I look at, but it's because when I worked for DCF, I worked statewide and I spent so much time looking at test scores and poverty numbers for different around the state. So I have these like weird bellwether districts that I look at to be like, oh, is this doing what I thought it would? Is this doing what I thought it would?
Interesting. Okay.
Which is how we've found a lot of the errors. So, and part of the reason that we waited a little bit to build this model is because we wanted to make some of those preliminary policy decisions from a place of pure policy rather than people being tied to the individual impacts that changing that pure policy might make.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
I think that's wise. But, because it's not how we usually do things, it does feel a little backward at this moment, even though logically I know that makes sense.
Yeah, it's also that it's like a huge load of work for our teams that could really use a break after their COVID session. And so we also, every time we make a decision or change our mind about something, everything needs to be recalibrated. It's actually not recalibrated. Recalibrated is a technical term. Everything needs to be reconfigured. There's recalculating, recalibrating, and reconfiguring.
Ooh.
Yeah. So everything needs to be reconfigured, and we also don't want to put them through the time and space. We've had a lot of staff transitions through this, and just like also trying to just be mindful of people's humanity. So that's where we are. And I'm looking forward to it. Once we actually see the numbers, then we're going to have a conversation around what does a transition look like? So how do we support districts that might be losing tax capacity or having a reduced tax capacity because of this work? How do we support districts that are going to have an increase in tax capacity because of this work? What are ways we can mitigate some of the challenges from this process? And we'll be looking at all sort of the policy tools at our fingertips to do that stuff.
Okay. And that sounds like, so the report is due to the legislature on December 15th. Does it seem like you'll be able to hit that benchmark, or will you need extra time, or how's that feeling?
Yeah, so there's no extra time.
Okay.
That's not a thing. What we do know is that the report might take a few different shapes. And, I'm trying, given the nature of the universe, and I think the level of peace that we need to try to strike with it lately, I'm trying to have a few different mental flow charts of what the report's going to look like in my mind. And acknowledge that no matter what the report says, and no matter how definitive the action plan is, we have at least 4 committees that are going to spend a decent chunk of time pulling it all apart and putting it back together. And so our primary job as a summer task force is to make sure that we pulled everything apart and understood it well enough so that when a committee starts pulling a thread, we can answer all their questions for them so that they don't have to take the time to do it during the session. Which is very different than I think a lot of a committee's work, which is moving an idea forward.
Right.
And so I think sometimes folks watching from the outside say like, why is someone bringing up that point? That's so like rude or so like adding complexity to something that's simple, or like that's so simple when like everyone knows the answer to that question. But I think as a summer task force, a lot of our task is to ask every single question that we think one of our colleagues will ask once we get to the session, so that we can spend the time digging in and answering it in advance. And so I think sometimes from the outside that makes things look like more circular and difficult than it would be if we were just moving this through a regular committee process, where my job in a regular committee would be sort of on a as a regular committee member, not as a chair, would be to just push my ideas forward.
Right.
As chair of a task force, my job is to make sure that every single idea is unearthed, examined, and resolved. And that's very, very different.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because if we don't do that, when it gets to committee, the committee is going to say, oh no, we need to explore this idea. And the whole thing will sink under the weight of people's curiosity. And that happens all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, and given the many years that we have been talking about this, there is a lot of curiosity, there's a lot of concern, there's a lot of feelings, and there's a lot of numbers for people to wade through. And the session really isn't that long.
No.
So if we want something to happen this session, people need to have a good foundational platform to come from.
Yeah, it's funny. I forget how short it is. And I was actually just signing my lease for my apartment in Montpelier yesterday and realizing like, oh, it's 4.5 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have a lot to get through in 4.5 months.
Yeah.
It goes like that. And guess what? So did our time today.
Oh no. Oh no. I didn't even talk about how the equalized pupils are equalized. What will we do?
You want to say, can you say it quickly?
Yeah. So we add up all the students. So like the extra students, so we have the actual number of real live students, and then we have all the extra students from the weights, and we add up all those students, and then we divide it by the actual number of students, which has a technical term, but I just like to call it the humans.
Mm-hmm.
So that at the end, we have no more equalized students around the state than we have actual students around the state. But what that means is that it looks like some districts have less students than they have humans, and some students have more students than they have humans. But it means that any district that is increasing their number of equalized students, there are other districts that are losing equalized students. And so
Gotcha.
Every factor that we weight has a interactive effect with every other factor that we weight. And so when you have 5 factors or 10 factors, all of a sudden things happen mathematically that are really, really hard to get your head around. And it's kind of exciting and kind of disconcerting.
Thank you, Emilie.
Yeah.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for tuning in this week. The Montpelier Happy Hour can be found on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro every Friday at 2 p.m. You can find us at the montpelierhappyhour.captivate.fm, our Facebook page, as well as wherever you find podcasts, and BCTV as well, our public access channel. And Emilie, where can folks find you?
EmilieKornheiser.org, where you can get links to all my social media channels, my newsletter, my email address, phone number, all the places to get in touch, and would love to hear from you.
Have a great weekend, everyone. We will see you next week.